And I think the same can be said for podcasts as well. People underestimate how difficult it is to make a podcast, even the most basic podcast, how much time actually goes into it. And maybe if they knew what it took before they got into it, they probably wouldn't do it or wouldn't judge maybe as much.
Podcast Junkies, episode 234. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you are new to the show, this is the one where we speak to interesting folks in the podcasting space, get them to kick back their heels and talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. Last week, we had a great conversation with Andy Foote, host of the Footnotes podcast. Andy is a LinkedIn specialist and an all-around jovial chap. I only say that because of his English accent, but we had a really good conversation and learned a lot about how to use the LinkedIn platform effectively. Episode 233, in case you missed that. This week, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jordan Gass-Poore. She's the host of Prognosis Daily, Coronavirus, and Sounds Like Hate, among other podcasts, which she produced. In this interview, she shares her experience as an investigative journalist and her fascination with audio as a medium and her early career aspirations. We talk about her favorite college radio story. Jordan and I actually met during the Outlier virtual festival probably about a month or two ago, and she was pitching a horror comedy podcast, and I was actually the judge on the panel, and we connected about the show she was working on, so we talk a little bit about that as well. We learned how she honed her skill of creating compelling audio content, and she shares some of the favorite stories she's heard through podcast producing and why people are just dying to tell their stories. We cover a couple of ongoing podcast projects, and she opens up what it's been like living in New York City during COVID. And finally, we talk about a little of the work she's doing with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Jordan has a lot of experience in the podcast producing world, and it's a very helpful episode for learning how to develop more compelling podcast content. If you enjoyed this episode or have enjoyed past episodes and you haven't done it already, I'd love it if you leave a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/podcast junkies. This episode is also brought to you by Fullcast. If you're looking for help as a business with your podcast, we offer done-for-you services, coaching and consulting with our done-with-you services. And now we also have the Ultimate Podcast Dojo available. It's a new course and community designed to help you start your own podcast. Additional details at fullcast.co/dojo, D-O-J-O. Stay tuned to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's get into this conversation with Jordan. Jordan Gass-Poore, podcast producer extraordinaire. Thank you again for sharing time with us on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks for having me on. Talking about great equalizers before.
Yeah, so I wasn't recording. And as most listeners will know, I love sharing all the foibles and faux pas of podcasting. So we started the conversation and I'm staring at the button and the button says record. And I'm like, I think it should say something different than record. It should be like a counter. So thankfully we hadn't gotten too far. So you were talking about we connected through Outlier Virtual Festival, this idea of you reaching out to him, and because that's what you do now, you just reach out to whoever you want to talk to.
Exactly. I mean, and it really does, now is the time. If you have someone that you really want to talk to, just reach out to them. Because I think the window is slowly closing, especially if they're a celebrity, because that's getting back on track. So
there's only so many TikTok videos J-Lo can do from her backyard. So
Exactly. They mix things up. And I think some people, regardless of your celebrity status or income, are so starved to talk to someone that's not living with them.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it's so funny because everybody realized how not important celebrities were once COVID hit. Just like we do not give a shit about you and your beautiful mansion, and you're just like, you're shooting videos from your swimming pool, and I'm just like, okay, there's a little bit of a disconnect there.
Exactly. And your cigars, and like I remember that Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think he was in like the hot tub or something with his giant cigar, and I'm like, I pity you not, sir.
Yeah. What was the experience for you? I mean, if you just a quick recap, we're recording this in August now, so obviously big wave hit in March, and it was interesting how many people were impacted and where people were at the time. Is interesting to get a snapshot of that. But just from a time capsule perspective, for folks listening in the future, like, what was your experience?
So I think, and this is carried on into the present day, and I'm hoping that it'll end shortly. And I shouldn't be complaining about this, but how I guess I coped with everything is piling on as much work as humanly possible and working, 14-hour plus days and just going as a way to sort of not have to deal with what's going on, especially I live in Queens, which was the epicenter of the epicenter at one point in time. And and it's interesting because I'm from Texas originally, and now Texas is having problems, and I get alerts from one of the local newspapers every day that's like X number of COVID cases today, X number of deaths. And it's just been interesting because I don't feel like I've been able to get over it, I think, as easily as people maybe who just live in New York and don't have family in another hotbed.
So can you talk about work environments? Obviously, everyone was forced to figure out how to make their bedroom a home studio. And people that had the luxury of going into recording spaces where it's a pristine recording environment. And especially, we'll talk a little bit about your background as well. So what was the change like for you, and how much of a shift was it from a recording? And if you have like high standards in terms of quality, like how do you manage all that in COVID now when you have to make do with what you have?
I really should lower my standards. And you think at this point my standards would be low, but every time I get another file back and there's really bad AC noise or something, I shouldn't be cursing because I do. And I'm like, I'm kidding me that this is again. And then I'm the one that's like, I sound like a robot. And I'm like, oh God, but do you want to hear that whirring in the background? Yeah. It's insane. But I should lower my standards. Maybe that's what I'll learn from all of this, is to lower my standards. But not much has really changed for me. I mean, I would go into different studios on different projects, a Monday, Wednesday, Friday kind of schedule here in New York.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the time, it's just content being sent to me from folks doing their own recordings. But I have been doing more of my own recordings with different projects. And it really was just the blanket situation on the bed and the pillows.
Yeah.
And having to explain to people, it's fine to look ridiculous because the video is not being used.
Did you actually record with the blanket on your head for and people were on video, or?
Well, there was so I didn't do that. That was for my own segments with a podcast that I work on. But for other folks where we were using another platform to record, and their audio just kept coming back sounding just terrible. And I was like, explain to me how you're recording this. And they were telling me, and I'm like, everything sounds good. Okay, and then it was like the AC or the water heater or some creaking noise. So I was like, just set up a pillow for it. And they were like, but I look ridiculous. I'm like, nobody cares what you look like.
Yeah.
Because it's audio.
Okay.
But they care what you sound like.
Or what's your earliest recollection of an interest in audio?
Probably a real interest was 2008, to date me. That's when I was a freshman in college.
Okay.
So as ridiculous as it sounds, I was not one to I didn't come from a family that listened to NPR. My family could probably care less if NPR existed or not outside of me being associated with them. We had a AM station in my hometown that played old country music that I interned for when I was in high school. So I guess maybe that was probably the original, but college, man. I went to the college newspaper team and I went to the college radio team, and I was like, college radio people are so much cooler. They were all tatted up with piercings and smoking outside. And then the college newspaper folks, for the most part, were really buttoned up. It was a big divide in how they looked. And
so you wanted to just hang out the cool kids.
Well, pretty much, and there was a guy, and I was like, he's cute. But yeah, so I ended up doing a little bit of both. But toward the end of my college time, it was obvious I was spending way more time in the studio.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed being in the studio more than I enjoyed being in the traditional newspaper newsroom.
Did you get a tattoo as well?
I did not. No, I did pick up a smoking habit, but not from them. But no tattoos, no piercings.
Okay.
But I still stay in contact with quite a few of those folks.
Yeah.
Including my former advisor, who's still the advisor at the radio station. He's badass. He's all tatted up too. He's a former DJ.
And so you graduated from Texas State?
Yeah, I graduated in Texas State University. And I go back, whenever I go back to Texas to see my family, I'll go back to my college town because I still have, you'll go to a local restaurant and see people that you went to school with or randomly walking down the street because they never left.
That's funny.
They tell you the gossip.
Yeah.
The town gossip.
And you see friends that you grew up with and have 5 or 6 kids and huge families and stuff.
And they're like, what are you doing with your life? What are you doing with your life?
Yeah. And then when you quickly realize how divergent your paths were, you try to find another topic to talk about.
Exactly. And it's weird to think, like, even if you both like did the college radio thing and we were both passionate about journalism and passionate about audio, and they tried it and they're not in it anymore. They're in PR usually.
Yeah.
Those folks.
So what was the goal when you graduated? What did you have your sights set on?
Well, initially, I mean, I think what a lot of people, at least at my college radio station, had, which was, that you would go either to one of the local, like if you were really into music, you'd go into like South by Southwest music, like helping the festival, or you'd go to like the local rock station.
Yeah.
Because San Marcos, where Texas State is only like 45 minutes away from Austin. And like, that's a dream to live in the big city.
So talk a little bit about where you started at and what were some of the first stories you were working on?
Yeah, so where I started, like outside of the college radio bubble,
Yeah.
which is so much cooler, though I think those stories than like the professional experience. Because they just let you do whatever.
We might have to come back and circle back to one of your favorite. Okay, let's pivot and kick it off with one of your favorite college radio station stories.
So college radio and like what I still do, messaging people out of the blue and being like, let's collaborate. I got to cover South by Southwest film all 4 years of college.
Okay, that's cool.
So they gave me a press badge, and at like 19, I was like, oh, I'm going to go meet everyone, and it's going to be great. I ran into, during South by Film and during another festival, I covered all kinds of festivals. I was always out and about.
Yeah.
Without a license, too. Without a driver's license, I took the bus. I was terrified to drive, but anyway, I met Elijah Wood, the actor, who I creepily have a crush on. Like, I don't know, I thought he was very attractive, and I still do, But I met him, and we like, it wasn't like, I mean, in my young eyes, I was like, oh my God, he's flirting with me, But he was like, hey, you should come to this like after party for my movie.
Wow.
And so I didn't drive, and the woman I was with who drove me, who was my photographer, it was pretty much like, okay, come take photos, we'll give me ride, exchange, cool. She was like, I have to go back to San Marcos to be with my boyfriend. And I'll never forget being like, are you kidding me? You're passing up a Hollywood party? Like, did you see that he put his arm on my shoulder? Did you see that connection?
Yeah.
And that was
it's so funny. I just saw an Elijah Wood movie. It's about him in Oregon, and he goes to visit an estranged father. It is like
I saw that.
The horror movie. It's like a dark black comedy type thing. Yeah, I was watching with my girlfriend, and we saw the first couple of seconds of the preview, and we're like, okay, let's watch it. So we had no idea what was coming, and then it was just like, whoa.
That was a weird movie.
Yeah. Do you remember the name of it? I'm looking for the name of it.
Something Daddy, right? Because like you think that, I mean, I don't want to give a spoiler away, but about his father, Yeah.
It's really good. I highly recommend. It's definitely surprising, a couple of twists, and so it was one of those things when you watch it and you're just like, you're entertained and surprised that it turned out to be a good movie. So it's a little bizarre, but Elijah Wood has the best haircut and mustache.
Oh, that was terrifying. He didn't look like that when I saw. He was very clean cut and about my height, which was kind of odd. We could wear the same clothes.
Are you over your Elijah Wood crush?
I mean, I think now he's a father, so I think now that automatically I'm like, I'm over the crush. But he seems like a very cool dude. And the interview, like he seemed very nice.
Come to daddy.
Yeah. So that's my one story that I'm like, I regret that damn. But college radio, I had the interview on my first podcast about Texas film. Yeah. That like, my glory days in podcasting when I was 18, 19.
Were you a podcaster in college?
Yeah. I mean, one of the beautiful things, again, in college radio, they're like, do whatever you want that's not violating FCC.
Okay.
And I was like, so I'm going to make this Texas film podcast to go talk to cool independent filmmakers. With the host. Maybe they pick up my screenplay, but that never happened. But, Are
you still shopping that?
No, but I'm not shopping it, but it is somewhere on some hard drive that I wrote in college, and who knows, one day.
This is going to be like the total, like, rambling, like, random thought to random thought episode of like, is there a common thread here that you guys are you getting somewhere? What's the premise of the screenplay?
It's so bad. It's not worth talking about them.
Summarize it in 10 words or less.
20-something woman goes back to her hometown after the death of the family matriarch. It takes place over the course of a weekend.
Okay.
Some shit goes down.
I think everyone feels like when they see a decent movie or they want. I don't think people underestimate how hard it is to write a good screenplay and how hard it is to like tell a story that keeps people engaged. Because when I watch some of them, sometimes I'm like, the fact that they were able to build a thread, a character development, carry it throughout the movie, keep you engaged, keep you interested in the characters. The dialogue is really punchy. It's witty, and there's like so many like millions of moving parts that go into a really good movie. That's why I'm fascinated when people can actually pull it together into something that's mildly interesting.
I agree. And I think the same can be said for podcasts as well. People underestimate how difficult it is to make a podcast, even the most basic podcast, how much time actually goes into it. And maybe if they knew what it took before they got into it, they probably wouldn't do it or wouldn't judge maybe as much.
Yeah. So after the cool jobs in college, interviewing and hanging out with famous celebrities, it was all downhill from there. Because
it was totally all downhill from there. I got older. Yes, it was a lot more serious. No more celebrities hitting on me. It was like, what is going on?
It'll come around full circle again. You just have to find the right podcast project. You get podcasters hitting on you, which is not the same.
It's not the same.
Who's the Elijah Wood of podcasting?
I don't
Elijah Wood. Elijah Wood.
Oh God, does he have a podcast? He probably
I don't know.
does have a podcast.
Everybody probably does that. There's no celebrity that doesn't have a podcast now.
No, that's why I don't even like looking at Apple Podcasts, like the recommendations or like the new shows, because it's just always some celebrity.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I didn't like your TV show. Why?
Who's doing work now that you admire, that you respect, or that you, not that you'd want to emulate, but that it's a style that you're drawn to?
I think that's a tough question, because for me now, and I mean, how we originally met, with the horror show, comedy show that I was wanting to do, and I've been thinking a lot in the last, couple of months about who is talking about horror and who's in that wheelhouse. And I just still have not found anyone that is breaking the let's talk about a movie and have a conversation about a movie mold. And I mean, if anybody knows of any other horror podcasts I should be listening to that kind of break that mold, please let me know. I'm interested.
So actually, for the benefit of the listener, can you talk a little bit about the premise? Because during the Outlier Festival, there was a portion where we had some podcasters come on, and I guess I was a celebrity judge. I don't know. I'm the Simon Cowell of podcasting now.
I mean, you have your quote on the Squadcast page.
That's true. Yeah. So yeah, it was cool to see a whole bunch of different premises for podcasting. So for those that weren't in attendance, talk about the show you were pitching.
Yeah, the show is pitching is a horror comedy podcast that is an interview style. However, it kind of spins it on its head a little bit to make the genre more accessible and to tie it to everyday events. So I have an episode that I did with one of my, going back to the film thing from college, there really is like a bookend.
Yeah.
I'm talking about celebrities who may just want to talk to people that are not their children. I interviewed the writer and director of one of my favorite movies called Tales from the Hood, and really emphasizing the fact that it's still culturally relevant after 25 years. I mean, there's talks about police brutality in 1995 when the movie came out. It talks about domestic violence, all these different themes, racist politicians, but it's still very relevant today.
Unfortunately, it's still really relevant today, yeah.
And which is why there's a third movie coming out. He's still making the movies. But yeah, that was a great conversation. And it was more like, one of my friends, of course, you get, as a podcaster, I'm sure you do this too, where like you have your friends listen to rough cuts before you publish them or anyone else listens. Yeah. And I mean, my poor friends, they've had to listen. Who knows how much they actually listen of the show. But one of my friends was like, what you're going for? You're going for like a Rod Serling meets Tina Fey style. I was like, I'm going to use that. Put that in the podcast review on Apple.
Yeah, that's funny.
But, it's just more like wanting to have horror be more of like an academic study, something that can be as culturally relevant, that is taken more seriously than like your slasher movie you're talking about, The Exorcist, for the umpteenth time.
Yeah.
I've listened to a couple of these horror interview podcasts, and they're great. It's two different people. Usually, like, one really loves horror, one doesn't love horror, and they watch Jaws or The Exorcist and are like talking about their reactions. Like, there's a place for that.
Yeah, there's a lot of those. Did you decide on a name?
Yeah. It's called Pod of Madness. There's a website. It's all over the place now. I wouldn't recommend doing interviews through Zoom. The audio quality, I was like...
Squadcast for the win. Yeah, I think I just saw an interesting movie. It's not horror. It's actually more sci-fi. Vast of Night. Have you seen
I've heard good things about that. I haven't watched it yet.
So good. It's one of my favorite movies of the year so far. I think like an indie, but executive produced by one guy who funded the whole thing. And the camera work is phenomenal. It sort of reminds me of that movie 8mm, the J.J. Abrams movie. So that kind of vibe, and it's set in a town in like Midwest town in like the 50s or 60s or something, 50s or something like that. So it has that old timey feel, but it's still sci-fi, and they do a lot where they kind of give you that. They're building up an anticipation, so it's not one of those where they're showing you like, the best horror movies are the ones where you don't see the monster.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's the kind of vibe. So
they don't show the alien?
Can't spoil it because it's such a beautiful movie. It's actually a beautiful movie, and I watched it twice already, and it's quickly like one of my favorites of 2020. Yeah,
that's good.
So that's the project you're working on now. So where did your aesthetic for how to create compelling audio content, like, probably didn't happen in one place, but how did you start to realize that that's something you like or you take pride in?
Not to say I live in the past, nostalgia. I did just turn 30, so maybe it's a lot of like reflection on my 20s. Like, oh my God, what happened? There was a coffee shop in my college town that I pretty much lived at. I spent more time in that place. I knew the owners. They would give me rides. I saw the owner from when she got pregnant to the birth to now the kid is like 10 years old. And, one of those places, like the Cheers of my 20s.
Central Perk.
Exactly. I think we were it's a way quirkier. There are a lot of tattoos again. You got the baristas. Okay. I picked up a lot of my music tastes from those baristas there. But sitting there all day, you'd have the like townies and the random people coming in and out. And my little table in the back was by the bathroom. So people would see you have an empty chair in front of you. And often, I'm not joking, just sit down and strike up a conversation with you while you're at your laptop trying to work.
Like sit in your chair?
So I would be sitting on one side, and the others, they wouldn't sit on me. I would have probably.
Is the seat taken?
They wouldn't even ask. He would mainly be like, they just sit down, like maybe they're waiting for the bathroom, or they just think they can just sit there because they're from that town. I don't know.
Is that like a Texas howdy neighbor thing, or?
I know. I think that's just the clientele at the coffee shop. Okay. But it was a lot of, and at the time I was still doing journalism and I was freelancing and whatever. And people tend to know, they were like, oh, you're the journalist too, like whatever. They would just sit down and I would strike up conversations with them. And the stories, it was just so random. I mean, I got a lot of content for various projects I was working on from just talking to customers at this local coffee shop. And that really is sort of like, the way that I approach interviews is very much based still to this day on the conversations I had with people at that coffee shop.
This episode is brought to you by Podcast Movement. This year's conference is virtual and will be held from October 19th through the 29th. Find out more at virtual.podcastmovement.com. This year, the world's largest conference for podcasters becomes the world's largest virtual online event in podcast history this October 19th through the 29th. There are 4 main event days spread across 2 weeks with optional workshops each day in between. Join thousands of podcasters from around the world for over 100 live interactive breakout sessions and workshops. Topics and tracks focused on everything from creating your show to monetizing your podcasts and will appeal to podcasters of all skill levels from brand new to experts. Over 150 virtual exhibitors will be there live to demo their latest podcasting gear, equipment, and services. Podcast Movement invested months into researching the virtual event platforms and has selected one that they feel is the best out there and can't wait for everyone to join them on it this October. Podcast Movement Virtual takes place October 19th through the 29th, and tickets start at $119. Visit virtual.podcastmovement.com, and if you sign up, use the code PODCASTJunkies for the biggest discount that you'll find anywhere. And remember, this discount ends soon. Once again, virtual.podcastmovement.com. The conference holds a special place in my heart since it's the very first podcasting conference I attended as a podcaster. And with the exception of the LA event, I've been to every single podcast movement. So excited to see what the team's putting together for October.
This sort of idea that I have about interviewing and journalism is very much based in the folks that I've encountered at this coffee shop. And it's a strange thing, like letting them just tell their story.
Yeah.
And interjecting here and again, but like just letting them say whatever they would like to say.
Is that something that you realized early on? Because this is something like new podcasters struggle with, because they just want to fill the space. They want to fill the dead air. They're just like, God forbid they don't have the next question ready, and they start freaking out. And every new podcaster goes through this. I mean, I know in the beginning I had my set of questions, and I'm just like, okay, I asked all the questions, and this 15 minutes are done. I got another 45 minutes. Just what am I going to say? So is that something that you realized early on, that most people, I've said this before, if you go to any room, any bar, if you ask the right questions to every single person in the room, you'll get a story out of them. And I think it's just a matter of being a good listener and follow up. I
agree. I mean, I think that since I, had wanted to do journalism since I was around like 8 years old, like a child, though I was, taught, and in high school journalism, like you're taught to have your set of questions, and you're taught to not stray away from those questions and to do the research and don't let people babble.
Yeah.
You don't have the time to let people babble. And so that was a big shift for me is, you don't have to be so serious either.
But there's a difference between people babbling and people struggling or trying to formulate the story they want to tell, and they may not have ever been given the opportunity, or when they start quote unquote babbling, people cut them off and be like, oh, you're not making any sense. So there's a weird thing that needs to happen where you can encourage them to say, I think there's a story there. And obviously the magic of post-production, you can, fix that up any way you want. But I think people are dying to tell their stories.
I agree. I mean, that's what I found out at Joe and the Go in San Marcos, Texas, is so many people, are dying to tell their story. And they just were waiting around for the opportunity to sit down in front of a stranger.
Did you find that people are sometimes more open to share stories with a stranger as opposed to someone they're close to, just because maybe they feel like they're not going to be judged?
Oh, I think so. And I think I'm a stranger in that coffee shop context, but I'm also not, because they've seen my face for months. It's like the weird idea of I know you, but I don't know you, because I know that you get a latte every day and you go and sit for hours in that corner booth and you have stickers on your laptop that tell me something about you, and strange people come in and give you rides, but so they maybe they thought they knew me or had some familiarity, so they felt comfortable.
What are the stickers on your laptop?
Oh, it varied. I mean, I always have random ass stickers covered in my laptop all the time, so.
Do you have any on your laptop currently?
Yeah, but this laptop's not mine, so it doesn't count. However, on my old laptop, the last one that was mine, I have this werewolf sticker. It's a werewolf riding a bicycle, so it's cool.
No significance at all, just a werewolf riding a bicycle?
One of my favorite horror movies is An American Werewolf in London.
Oh,
so that's why I got the werewolf riding a bicycle.
That movie scared the shit out of me. That was one of those movies when you watch early on, because the guy who did the special effects is the same guy who did Thriller Video.
Yes.
And so the makeup on that is a scary movie. That's not a movie that a kid should be watching. I'll tell you that much. That movie will scare the shit out of you. I also saw Alien, the first one.
That one scared me too. The scene where it comes out of his stomach.
Yeah. So that was 79. So I'm actually 49. So I was probably, and it was on TV, so it was out of the theater. So it was probably early 80s. So it's probably 10, 11, 12. And I remember watching it in this room where my aunt had her TV, and there was an adult party going on. And I'm just sitting there by myself in this room watching Alien on a small TV. It was really dark, and the movie itself is very creepy. But full circle, I had the ability when I lived in LA to interview Ronald Shusett, who's the co-writer, co-creator of Alien.
That's cool.
And he tells the story of he dreamed up the scene. They were trying to figure out how to get the alien from the planet to the ship, and they couldn't figure out like the storyline. And so he said he had a dream where it's like, oh, like the alien goes inside the guy's stomach, and then the stomach bursts, and it was all like so he comes running back to his partner. He's like, I got it, I figured it out. And it's funny to hear him tell the story, but yeah, he's a character. It's called An Alien in Hollywood. So yeah, people started getting comfortable with you and telling you stories. Any specific stories stand out?
Well, there was one gentleman that I guess it was, we had multiple conversations, and the reason I remember his stories, his name is Steve. I don't know if he's still alive or not. I'm not certain what happened to Steve, but yeah. He was a former pool shark.
Okay.
And he had also spent a lot of time in Las Vegas gambling, and his stories were hilarious. He wrote and self-published a book that I may or may not still have in my childhood home, but he was called Steve the Snake. And he just told the most ridiculous stories about like the ex-wives, like what you would expect from like a pool shark, and going on the tournament and then ending up super broke, which brought him to San Marcos, Texas. And he would wear these like Tommy Bahama type shirts, like the Hawaiian print shirts, and his flip-flops, like, he was ready to go to the beach. There's no beach.
Jimmy Buffett style, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the characters like that, and there were a lot of old hippies in the town. And I mean, the baristas had their own stories. And one of the baristas actually, it was a guy. We got to be really good friends, and he died while I was in college. And so that was a whole thing, and like very much like the first experience I had as a 20-something, being like, wow, I can die in my 20s? Like, wait, I didn't know that was possible. I mean, I did, but I didn't know.
Yeah, facing your own mortality is a little weird when that first happens.
Yeah. So those kinds of stories, like the people that you remember who, I mean, he wasn't the only one, unfortunately, that died while I was. I mean, it wasn't me.
People are going to start to think this is where the podcast turns into a horror movie, and it's like the podcaster did it.
It wasn't me. Unfortunately, 20-somethings often don't make the best decisions 100% of the time, and that could end it end things.
Yeah. So fast forward now to present time. Talk a little bit about the projects you're working on now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm been a freelancer. It'll be going on full-time a year, come like the middle of September, which is weird because it does not feel like a year. It feels like 2 months has gone by. But also an eternity, too. But yeah, I'm working with Bloomberg still on a daily coronavirus podcast because, believe it or not, we're not over COVID-19, so the podcast continues.
Yeah.
That's a daily show. I'm also working with the Southern Poverty Law Center on a podcast called Sounds Like Hate, which is talking about hate groups in the U.S. and how people are working on disengaging from a life of hate. So that's been fascinating. Working on all these different projects, too. It's like every day you're splitting your time and it's a different topic. Like, okay, you got COVID brain right here. Then you got the hate groups here. And then you got talking about horror down here. And then you're doing like a entrepreneur podcast over here. And and then it's like local news. Yeah. There's just a lot going on to keep straight.
How has the story or the narrative changed for you guys at Bloomberg? Talk about like the idea. Were you on board from day one when they started the idea came up that they wanted to do that show?
Yeah. So I originally got hired to work on another podcast about the gender pay gap. So that was, I went to the office twice, got my badge, got to look around, and we were all on our planning meeting for that podcast, getting audio together, and then it was, they're closing the office. I was like, okay. And they were like, do you want to stay on instead of, I guess, telling me there's no work? They were like, do you want to stay on and help us with this show? And so, yeah, I was on board from day one. I wasn't obviously part of, like, the conversation about whether or not we should have a daily coronavirus podcast. It was, we need another producer. So yeah, I've been with them since that show started, and it was like 5 days a week. And now it's been whittled down a little bit because the news cycle is slowly changed. I think, people have some fatigue as well.
A little corona fatigue, maybe?
A little.
Is this the Bloomberg office, like 53rd and 3rd?
Is that Lexington?
57th and Lex, yeah.
Yeah.
I used to work at E-Trade at 57th and Lex, and I think that Bloomberg building went up, I think, when I was working there. And I remember it was like a block or two away. It's a beautiful building.
It's really nice.
It's a beautiful empty building right now.
I wonder what happened to the koi fish, because they have a koi pond in there.
Poor koi fish.
I saw him once, and I was like, there's a koi pond.
This is the digression episode. What's the story with New York City? Because, I mean, I have a special place in New York City. I've lived in there a couple different times, like Upper East Side, Lower East Side. I lived in Greenpoint. I just love the energy of it, but I think from everything I've seen, and that Malcolm Gladwell or someone wrote about the death of New York City, but apparently it's like some sketchy times going on there, and people are leaving in droves. And obviously they're talking about all the rich people with houses elsewhere who can leave, but I'm like, there's a lot of people that live in New York that actually are going to stay. So I'm wondering what it's like for you on the ground, what the experience has been.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't know anyone that has left New York City or has any plans to leave New York City, but obviously that's for a variety of reasons. It's either, I guess, maybe move back to their parents' house or stay in New York,
yeah.
And they're going to stay in New York instead of doing that. But I've seen like it get back more into the groove of what it was before the pandemic, meaning that because of the outdoor seating, like I've seen restaurants that normally would have no one or very little people on a Friday night now have not only more room outside than they ever did inside, but like now they're packed because people are staying closer to home to eat than they used to. I mean, even for me, I've been to more of the local restaurants in my neighborhood than usually I would just go out to Greenpoint or Williamsburg because I can walk over there. But like, I don't see a death of the city.
I think what's happening, and the restaurant thing is fascinating because it's almost like it's harkens back to like European style. Like I've seen like they've closed off half the street and now they're fighting to keep it that way. A lot of the people are just like, hey, this is beautiful. Like, why do we need to go back? And it's in a weird way, I think this idea of community living in New York City, which no one thought was possible because the rents are ridiculous. I think we're going to start to see more of that, is my guess. New York is going to go through a transition, and New York City, specifically Manhattan, like people are not coming back to work in these high-rise buildings. And they were saying some of these buildings have like 10,000 people in them, and now they have like 600. I think there was the Time Life building or one of those buildings. And it was just because I don't see how employees are going to feel comfortable going back. Companies have decided, okay, we were forced to do this remote working test, and we can have 1,000 people working remotely, and we don't have to pay anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000 rents or whatever it is that people are paying in New York City nowadays. So I was talking to the team from Chartable, and they had an office in New York City, and they don't need that office anymore. So it's been interesting it's going to be interesting to see what happens like on a social experiment level and what that's going to mean for what New York City looks like. It's not like I don't live there anymore, but it's not like that space can't be used for like housing. We kind of need that.
And we're going to need it even more after the pandemic. Yeah. I mean, I think this is also a really good opportunity to push my love of local news and local podcasting. This is a great opportunity for people to start covering their own backyards as well. Yeah. Because I really do think like what we just described or what you just described has not really been the narrative in national publications. It is more like the death of New York City. But there's actually some positives and some really nice responses to the pandemic. And so, I mean, I think this is a really good time for people if you've always wanted to cover your neighborhood and to talk to your neighbors. Say that you have a podcast. Create a podcast.
What are you waiting for?
Oh, I'm not waiting for anything.
Get on it. That's your next project. You need another project, right?
Oh, I don't need another project. But somebody, cover your own backyard, and that's not just New York City.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's interesting because I'm kind of bummed they canceled Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act show on Netflix.
They canceled it?
It was so
Why?
good. It was because they're stupid. I don't know. Like,
It didn't seem expensive to make.
No,
like,
he was literally doing it at home the last couple episodes, and it was so topical and relevant, and he was covering some of these topics that you would just watch and be like, oh, wait, the tax, he was covering TurboTax or something like that one episode, and it was just like, wait, what happens here? And then he's covering like endowments, universities, and he was
the cruise ships. That's how I found out about how they pollute. I watched it and was like, oh my god!
Every time I would watch an episode, I'd be laughing, and at the same time, I'd be like pulling my hair out. Like, there's no way that this can be happening right now. So that's a shame. So yeah, I think there's more opportunities to tell those types of stories, I think. But one of them was the death of local news. And because all these conglomerates are buying out, they're getting owned by these bigger companies, like there's no more news that's telling the stories of stuff that's happening on the ground that people are sort of getting away with now, because there's no on the beat journalist that's going to like trail someone around town, just be like getting the story and just stuff like that doesn't happen anymore. So
exactly. And I mean, that's why I really hope too that podcasting does not go the way that newspapers went, meaning that larger companies buying smaller houses and shows and having the top only 3 companies owning and being gatekeepers.
But I think the distribution is so spread out now that people can promote their stuff, anything from their own website to, Twitter to a Substack newsletter to like literally anything, Medium, like it's so spread out and democratized in a way, obviously, unless you're trying to get tens of thousands, 100,000 listeners, but you don't need a lot. And Libsyn routinely publishes that stat that if you're getting 120 downloads in the first 30 days an episode goes live, you're doing better than 50% of all shows. So
that's crazy.
And it's so that's why I think it's kind of like that long tail of like, I tell clients all the time, just, be as niche as possible, because if you think you're niche, like go one level more niche. And like, I remember some of these early shows I heard about, like the Welders podcast. Like welders have a lot of free time on their hands, so they're just sitting there. Like, so the Corner Cast or Coroners podcast, it was like a podcast for coroners. I'm like, these are awesome. Yeah. So, for anyone who thinks it's still too late, I was just on an interview earlier that I thought when I started my show in 2014 it was late, but now it's just like there's still opportunities, I think. And if it's a decent quality show and you take pride in the content and the quality, you're going to find a little bit of a listenership, and I think that's enough.
No, that's good advice. Now you make me think like you should even go nicher now. Like, yeah, like okay, only like one subgroup of the horror genre.
There's podcasts about specific artists. I think there's a Jean-Claude Van Damme podcast, or there's something about or Steven Seagal. There's like a podcast just about the one actor's movies or something like that. So you could do the Elijah Wood podcast.
Hey, he has a horror production company too. Like he is.
So he probably produced that movie.
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah, Spectre Vision, I think, is the company's.
Okay, so this is the worst segue ever. Speaking of the horrors of horror movies into the horrors of poverty, I talk about your work at the Southern Poverty Law Center. I warned you that was going to be a horrible segue. It's okay.
The horrors of hate groups. It's all horrific.
Were you around for the beginning of that as well, the start of that?
No. So, yeah, I came on board only about like a month and a half ago. But I've been aware of the podcast. It's been a long time coming. It's with 2 really amazing journalists. They come from broadcast and film. They're documentarians. And that I stumbled across one of their names and this project in January. So before the pandemic. And we hit it off, but I was going to go visit family in Spain when they like wanted me to like do an assignment, anyway, timetables did not match up. And then they reached out to me again, and I was like, yeah, I have some time. And I was very passionate about the cause and their mission for this podcast. And so, yeah, it's been very interesting because this is something that I have a little background on, like covering some of these groups, but that's not my wheelhouse in particular. We all know death is my wheelhouse, so
That's your new show, Death is My Wheelhouse. What is just one story from that you either worked on that you were surprised about, that as much as we know a lot that there's hate going on, that's still a topic that's front and center, and especially if you watch any sort of keep track of any of the conversations that are happening on Twitter, you can see we're not far removed from this fracturing of splinters of divisions of this country. So what's something that stood out for you as you were doing research into the show?
I think one of the things that stood out to me is that shouldn't have come as a surprise, but I have become more aware or just aware of different websites. Like there's a website called iFunny. I had never even heard of this website before. When I looked it up and when I actually went on it, it all seems to be, fine. And then you go in deeper and you're like, it's not fine. And you listen to, recordings or you're doing more research on these groups and people keep referencing that website. And it's just like some of these more innocuous, even like YouTube. We had a couple of experts being like, it's not like they're going on the dark web, in quotes. They're on YouTube. They're on these platforms. They just know and are more sophisticated enough now to have their own language. So it gets around censor. So like there's
interesting
words they're saying. And I'm like, this is stupid. What does this even mean? Like, because they're not using they have to use code words. Yeah. It's just really, that fascinated
wild
me.
And disturbing, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you heard, listen to Rabbit Hole?
I haven't. No, but one of my friends, New York Times, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so good. It's really good. Yeah, it describes like the algorithm, like basically YouTube, once you have to watch, they've changed it since I think, but once you watch the one video, it'll say, if you like this, then you'll like this. And it just takes you down this rabbit hole of like shit that you're like QAnon and all these like conspiracy things. And it's really, really fascinating. But
I need to make sure always use incognito mode because I have made that mistake where I'm looking at something and I'm like, oh shit. No, now it's going to think and the FBI is going to come and knock on the door. I got to tell them, no, my dad's Hispanic. Like, I'm not part of a white supremacist group.
I think I have some of my ancestors. I think my dad's grandfather, great-grandfather was probably from Spain because I was born in El Salvador and then I went back.
Oh, you were born in El Salvador.
I was born in El Salvador, but I didn't look like Salvadorians because they're just like shorter. They have like straight hair, very mestizo looking. And I went there and it was like, I don't know. I didn't. You're supposed to feel like motherland. You're back. You're like, oh my god, I'm the motherland. And I'm
I
just
look like everyone. It's finally where I belong.
Yeah, I'm just like, nope. I'm like definitely a third world country. AK-47s at the gas station. From the military, and some guy following us up on the hiking path with a machete in his hand, and just like, okay, okay, I'm ready to go back home. So,
have you been to Spain?
Yeah, I've been to Spain.
Because I will just say, like, you do look like there's features that are very...
I feel like a Pole there. So I think if you look at our family name, Duran is actually Spaniard. So that's another podcast. Maybe I'll just do a podcast about tracing my roots or something like that.
Hey, you should. I was even thinking if at one point in time I ever can like take a year off.
Yeah.
My ancestors, well, I shouldn't even say ancestors because the Spanish Civil War really was not that long ago. But no, I found out recently that my grandmother's brother, he died during the war when he was 16. I always thought he was fighting against Franco, the dictator, former dictator of Spain. No, he was fighting for. My family is very, to this day, fascist sentiments. So I was like, I want to do a whole thing on my family's history during the war.
That's funny.
Leading up to the present day. And like how, I guess so, yeah, fascism, hate groups, my interests, It's all just death, really, though.
I like how you should just put that things I'm interested in, hobbies include fascism, horror, hate crimes, dark web, Elijah Wood.
Dark web scares me. I'm not, no.
If you put all the Venn diagrams, if you put them all together.
I sound like a real happy person. I know.
So, Jordan, as we try to bring this to a landing somehow, a couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Definitely not death. I think something I changed my mind recently is that 30 is not old.
Yeah. And neither is 50, for the record.
I did have some middle schoolers because I am a mentor and I was interviewing prospective mentees through a program called Girls Right Now. And this one mentee was like, one of my favorite shows is this like Korean drama. And this character is really old. They're 30. And I just started laughing during the interview. And I was like, I just turned 30. She was, no, I thought you were 23. And I was like, yeah, sure you did.
Yeah. Since we're just all over the place, speaking of Korean dramas, have you seen Parasite?
I have not yet, because I've been waiting because I know the movie is going to elicit feelings that I don't know if I'm ready to
Very good. So you've already got a list of stuff to watch. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
That I'm not a dark person.
Happy-go-lucky.
I have a horse on my cardigan. Okay.
Okay.
There's a cowboy on the back. Anyway.
Well, that's a Texas thing. I was in Austin with my girlfriend, and we were at a bar, and a guy. People think it's a joke, but a guy literally rode up on a horse, and he just kind of.
What bar is this?
It was in Austin somewhere, like downtown or uptown. I don't know, one of those towns.
Oh my god!
But he just literally pulled up to the bar, and he just got off his horse, and then went inside, and he wasn't like classic cowboy because he ordered a Red Bull. So he's just sitting there drinking a Red Bull on the rocks, and we're coming over and we're just petting his horse, and then he's like, "Okay, I'm done now." Gets back on the horse and just gallops off into the sunset. So, yep, we're in Texas now.
Welcome
to Texas. Thank you, Jordan. I'm glad we were able to finally get this going. And it, given the fits and starts, including a session where you were actually on Squadcast and watching me talk to my girlfriend, and I was on mute. And
that's who you were talking. I just heard Scotland.
Her ex is from Scotland. Or, I had mentioned something about that anyway. It was funny because I was wondering, I was like, what did I say? I was like, did I say something inappropriate? Because I had it on mute and it was on a different browser tab. And then I saw the red light and I was like, oh shit. And then I came back and you're just sitting on the screen and it's on mute and you're just laughing. And I was like, we're going to have to reschedule. So that's the behind the scenes of the life of podcasting. So if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to engage with Jordan further, what's the best place for folks to track you down?
I would say the best place is Twitter, but maybe not. But I mean, I keep it simple. Everything of mine, if you, I guess, ever want to find me, it's always at JGASSPOORE, at Gass-Poore with no hyphen.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah,
and no apostrophe, I don't know. Gass-Poore all over the internet.
All over the place. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. This was entertaining, wide-ranging, and a bit all over the place, which is the best podcast episode sometimes.
That's what I like.
So thanks again to Jordan for coming on the show. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/234. Once again, if you enjoyed this episode or past episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. Special thanks to our sponsor. Podcast Movement Virtual takes place October 19th through the 29th. Visit virtual.podcastmovement.com, and if you sign up, use the code PodcastJunkies for the biggest discount that you'll find anywhere. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Check out his full line of music at cedarsoil.com. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. If your company would like to understand how a podcast can help you build your brand, sign up for a free consultation call at fullcast.co/chat15. Tune in next week for my conversation with Brad Hart, host of the Make More Marbles podcast. If you made it this far, you're waiting for the retention hashtag, no doubt. For this episode, let's go with journalist Jordan. One word, journalist Jordan, and you can tag her at Gass-Poore, that's JGASSPOORE, and myself at podcast_junkies. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Talk to you again next week.